Bonjour, habari saleo. My name is Daniel Adeni, a professional officer at Eclair Africa.
My name is Sinetemba Mtetwa, an intern at Eclair Africa.
My name is Paul Curry, manager of the Urban Systems Unit at Eclair Africa. On behalf of Eclair Africa, the African Centre for Cities, Our Future Cities, and partners, I'm excited to welcome all of you to the Rise Africa 2021 Action Festival.
Rise Africa has been growing as a platform of thinkers, doers, and enablers, committed to inspiring action for sustainable cities.
Rise Africa is about building active networks across academia, government, private sector, civil society, and the arts.
Our entry point is not based on articulating problems followed by proposing solutions, but rather on celebrating our cities as places of innovation and culture, while asking, what more can we do to make them sustainable, inclusive, and vibrant?
This festival is hosting 46 sessions from across 16 countries in Africa and the world. Every session aims to share new ideas, showcase ongoing actions, and launch new initiatives by bringing participants together to chart a new route forward.
We hope that the festival program will inspire you to commit to one or more specific actions that you or your organization will take on. As this session closes, you will be redirected to a survey in which you can articulate these actions. We will follow up on these committed actions throughout the year and offer resources, connections, and support. In this way, we are testing the idea that events can galvanize actions, and we hope that you will join us in this effort.
Beyond the session, there are many ways to take part in the festival.
Register for further sessions.
Vote for your favorites in the photo competition.
Watch a variety of inspiring video provocations.
Test your knowledge of African cities from our daily quiz.
And listen and dance to the Rise Africa 2021 playlist.
We hope that you will make all the attempts to reach out to new people and build long-lasting connections.
Before we begin, it is important to note that this session is being recorded, and that by participating, you are consenting to be recorded. All the recordings will be available on the program page after the festival.
And may I say that creative expression is vital for creating new futures for our cities. So we invite you to enter this session in the spirit of creativity and dreaming. Thank you very much.
To my future children, I bequeath this continent, borders lowered and turned into a soft pile of dust, smooth sand under steady feet. Your birthright is a country of flowers, a city that holds you even with your complicated lineage, the way this city has held my heart, held its arms out for all of the lost people who found solace in it. Your heirloom is this land and all its wormholes, portals hidden in plain sight between city skyscrapers, where people from here resemble people from far away places, and differences are muted while life happens. I reimagine you a country that does not cage its doves, a bequest of waters that pool precious histories, mountains that stand guard to protect against the unknown, a nation who preserves compassion over everything else, a mouth that can home many languages, and a spirit that rises above its fears.
My name is Finzi Saidi. I am an academic at the University of Johannesburg. I am specifically in what we call the Graduate School of Architecture, and by training I'm an architect and also a landscape architect. Hence my interest in public space. Just to also introduce that the last couple of years I've been interested in exploring what public space is through a research unit that we call Unit 15X in the Graduate School of Architecture. And I've taken students from our school in Johannesburg to 2 or 3 African cities, Kampala first in 2019, in which we explored the public spaces of the settlements near Lake Victoria's, informal settlements. And then the last 2 years in 2019 and 2020, we traveled to Dar es Salaam in partnership with ADI University in Dar es Salaam. We worked with students from planning, architecture, and landscape architects to look at public spaces within the city of Dar es Salaam. And of course, we did go to look at public spaces also in Zanzibar. So with that, we've produced a number of research projects that visualize what could be public space of the future on the African continent. And of course, some of the projects are from here, from home in and around Johannesburg. So that's my interest. But overall, I think the question of public space is one that should concern us going forward in the future because of a number of things. We know that cities are growing in Africa at a very fast and phenomenal rate. And that means that public open space will be under threat from especially development, from those people who have money to develop. But what about people who need to have access to public space? And therefore, I think it sets a challenge for us to find innovative ways in which to think, to plan, to design, and maintain public space that guarantee access and equity of use of public space in cities. So with that, I think that's my own introduction. The whole session is organized by the Center for African Public Spaces, which is a collaboration with the City of Johannesburg, the universities around Johannesburg, the JDA, and other partners. It's a growing concern, and I hope this session will actually provide us with points on which to elevate this project so that it really becomes an African agenda. And I think to add the African agenda, I'm driven in part by Thabo Mbeki's speech, which he made a number of years ago. I am an African. If you haven't heard it, please Google it, you will find it. And that really sets the agenda of what we're doing today. Before I think I go ahead and introduce the session, I would like to request all of you, the participants, that we would like to keep in touch with you. And I'm asking that in the chat, please post your name, your country and city of origin, email address, and of course, the public spaces that you've been involved in. But even if you haven't been involved in a public space, we still want to have your contacts so that we can build this growing body of interest in African public spaces. So please feel free to add your details or I urge you to add your details in that link or in the chat of this link. We have 3 panelists in this session. First is Ayanda Roji, who is a director at the Johannesburg City Parks and Zoos. She has been working with Nicolette and the likes of myself and others at Wits universities to really galvanize the Center of African Public Spaces. Ayanda will be speaking about, firstly, about a particular project and how the city of Johannesburg has rolled out the program on public space. Then second to speak will be Marc Sherratt, who will be speaking on a specific park of light located on the Braamfontein Spruit, which is a stream, in other words, in Johannesburg, looking at an approach of African parkland and problem solving relating to our contextual problem of economic and housing challenges within our context. And lastly, Nicolette will be speaking about the center through discussing two complex public spaces in Johannesburg, Jeppe and Braamfontein Spruit. And she will be presenting, I believe, from the point of view of the JDA, Johannesburg Development Agency, their experience in these processes. And finally, Ayanda will wrap it up with me doing the summary at the end. And of course, there will be time for questions for your participation. So that's the program. And I do think with that, we should be ready to go. Is there anything, Yasmin, that I've left out?
No,
any caretaking, any other business before we start?
No, that's okay. Thanks, Finzi. We can proceed.
Thank you, Tandy. I can read some of the participants' details coming up. But yes, with that, I would like to hand over to Ayanda. Ayanda, you have 15 minutes. I'll find a way of indicating to you the time as we go along. So Ayanda, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Finzi. And greetings, everyone. It's so good to see you here. So I will walk you through the journey of establishing the Center on African Public Spaces. So I'll talk about how the idea came about, what is the role, and what are some of the interventions that are envisaged. But just to say that the center is in its early stages. I don't know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Is it full screen? Okay. All right. So through our work in the city of Johannesburg, when I say our work, through the work of Johannesburg City Parks and Zoo and other departments within the city of Johannesburg, like Johannesburg Development Agency and public safety, through focusing on creating safer spaces in Johannesburg and through engaging other African cities and working with NGOs and also with universities, we identified gaps between what we aspire our cities to be like in future, to be more just, to be more inclusive and sustainable, what we might end up having, you know, if we continue doing what we do, we might end up having cities that are characterized by all forms of closure or of closures, cities that are like concrete jungle with loss of public space and characterized by exclusions. So the work that we did in Johannesburg with this myriad of stakeholders highlighted the importance of public spaces or shared spaces in city making. And I think with one of the beauty of public spaces is the fact that it touches other disciplines and other sectors. So we also noticed that if we broaden the conception of public space, how public spaces are seen in general, especially in African cities, they are narrowly thought of as green and tranquil European parks, reserves, botanical gardens, and so forth. So if you ask people from other African cities, when you talk about public space, so they think about parks, nature reserves, and so forth. And yes, they are public spaces, and they are very important considering the benefits that they offer around ecosystem services, excuse me, biodiversity conservation, and also around resilience or climate action. But so they will mention that. But there are other public spaces in African cities that are so important. So we considered that we need to broaden the concept of public space to include the spaces that are so popular and important and that are so much used like every day. And we thought that if we do that and if we promote linking of these public spaces closed and open and considering or informed by how ordinary citizens are navigating our cities and whether they could form a network rather than build as they are built now as isolated, we could like move towards this more inclusive and sustainable cities. Yes, when we talk about public spaces and when we ask people, they do mention recreational spaces, and they are so important in terms of the identity of the city or the identity of citizens. So people do mention that, but we hardly hear people talk about the public spaces that are so heavily used and that are so much loved that we see in African cities, especially in CBDs. And these are so important, and COVID showed us that the importance of squares, of markets, of transport hubs. And I think they're important to be integrated in city making. And also it's important to consider the policies and the bylaws that we put, not to be punitive and so forth. So what COVID highlighted is the importance of these spaces, but also of informal workers, given the nature of our economy, and also these spaces in terms of sustaining our livelihoods. There are other spaces that are so important, spaces like community halls or multifunctional centers. This is where young people find information about jobs or training opportunities, but also spaces for play for children. Our public spaces are also important in the African context, in the sense issues around health and spirituality are issues that are so important. Most Africans believe nature is inherently sacred and it has a power to heal and transform. So public spaces like nature reserves and copies or top of mountains, they become so important. Some are used as sites for rituals, and others are believed to be places to communicate with ancestors, and as they are imbued with secrets of the past or people that have gone before us. So these are also public spaces that should be like included when we talk about the concept of public spaces. I think in the Johannesburg case, we hear more and more like parents and grandparents talk about the need, or people that have moved from rural areas talk about the need to sort of transfer knowledge to younger generation. So to pass on this knowledge that may otherwise lose touch, where people may otherwise lose touch with their rural roots or with who they are. So public spaces, they prove to be so powerful and important in terms of being platforms for storytelling, but also traditional dancing. And we can see now through COVID as platforms for urban agriculture, and this intergenerational interaction takes place. I think the slide goes without saying that public spaces are where people come together and discuss matters of the state or of community and concerns. So there are spaces that are so important. And for urban poor, they are like the first contact with the city. We see that there are other public spaces that are important, especially to people who live in informal settlements or slums. They are like breathing space, you know, between the dense housing setting. And there's a case in Cape Town, it's called Mtonjeni. It's a public tap or it's a water collection point, which serves as a multifunctional space. So beyond just fetching water, people gather and also they promote the space for early childhood development programs, and also that prevents children from issues of crime and so forth. In African cities, public spaces are also invested with deep spiritual meaning. They are places of worship for us. I mean, across different reserves are places where groups of people congregate and play. And we see in cities like Johannesburg and Tshwane, where people come from other African cities to look for economic opportunities, that they are so important because that's where people form strong bonds, and and people from diverse backgrounds. So they give people a sense of belonging, the gathering in public spaces, and something that is so central in African uses and the meaning of public space is things that we think that they need to be integrated when we talk about the definition of public space. I won't dwell much on this, but again, public spaces are so important as democratic spaces because we look at them as equalizers, but we know that that's not the case in some contexts or in other times. So they play a major role in terms of in our democracy, serving as spaces where everyone can come together. And more, for those living in formal settlements, public spaces are like extension of their homes, and also for the cities down and outs, this is where they find refuge, especially people who are experiencing homelessness. So besides what I'm talking about as public spaces, as being all these good things, social integrators, spaces where people congregate, they are not neutral spaces. So they are places where societal issues around crime, issues around inequalities that are acted on or that are acted out. Just a last slide on my side, just to reflect on what COVID has uncovered. I think the pandemic has turned the spotlight on inequalities, both societal and systematic. And it's things that we knew before, but the pandemic has sort of worsened them. In the case of South African cities, because of our history of apartheid and also colonialism, it has shown that we have green apartheid. We have public spaces or green spaces are unevenly distributed. So you can have two communities living side by side, but leading different lives. But also the pandemic has reintroduced us to our neighborhoods. We began to sort of love our neighborhoods again, depending on whether you live in an affluent neighborhood. If you are not, you begin to see the gaps and the things that you don't have. So I think the question is, what becomes the role of public spaces in addressing and also in contributing to change that is needed? Thank you. I'll hand over to Marc.
Thank you, Ayanda. Marc, you up next. So whenever you're ready.
Well, good morning or good evening to everyone who's listening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Ayanda for setting the scene for us. My name is Marc Sherratt. I am a professional architect by training, and I run a practice in Johannesburg. And this is a project that really started out of a conversation that we had with City Parks. We went and had a meeting with them, really having a passion for our city's parks, and said, give us your most difficult problem to solve. And they were clear and honest about that and said, give us a solution to park dwelling or homelessness. And that's really the background to this project, which you'll see how we've started to approach. So yes, this project is called the Park of Light. It's located in the Braamfontein Spruit. Spruit is the Afrikaans name for a small stream. The Braamfontein Spruit itself is probably the longest stream in Johannesburg. And generally, Johannesburg has developed quite quickly as a city, less than 200 years old. And so the only real natural habitats left are your kind of stream areas and koppies or small hills. So they've really become very important places for the city to really engage with. This is just, if you know Johannesburg, Delta Park, as you'll see on the left, is kind of the biggest green area within the kind of city's spectrum. This is the Braamfontein Spruit, and our study area, what we've termed kind of the nozzle, is quite a restricted area of space that you see is kind of along Jan Smuts Avenue, which is a high vehicular entry route into the city. Just zooming in specifically into our study area, you've got a roadway on the left-hand side. You've got different types of public space, from kind of sports facilities in old parks. You've got an art school called Vega, and you've got residential suburb around that. What's really interesting about the site itself is just the separation of different economic groups that you find. So Sandton is kind of quite a wealthy area. Your Randburg area is mainly middle class, and then you do have park dwellers or homeless living within the park itself, both underneath the bridge and underneath other trees within the park. So you really have a coming together of your three different social economic groups within this one space. And mostly there's a bit of tension between these social economic groups. So that really became the starting point for us to see how we can bridge these gaps and really question who are the actual users of the park, and has the park been designed specifically for that. This is just some photographs, on-site photographs of the specific study area. We've kind of thresholded the space between a bridge and a waterfall. This is where some of the homeless sleep. And you can see the kind of vegetation. Most of the species you're seeing here are non-invasive or exotic species. So you've got blue gum and wild syringa and other species like that. And as you can see, electricity pylons are quite iconic in Johannesburg's open spaces. They've kind of kept a lot of the spaces open because of kind of the illegality of being able to build underneath them. The historical change of the Braamfontein Spruit, originally before the city came, it was kind of a wetland slash small stream area with natural grassland and koppie. And most of your forested tree areas would have been found along the Spruit, because Johannesburg was originally kind of an open grassland landscape. And so this was going to be one of the few places in which you found trees actually growing was around these, what they call kind of fire shadows along Spruits. Then in 1914, early 1900s, you had kind of a formal, almost making the Spruit into a canal for kind of recreational use. And that's where a lot of the kind of European understanding of parks came in terms of planting systems involving kind of big trees and treating of kind of stormwater. When people ask me kind of who are my heroes, this is Alfred Mkhize. He's one of the guys who lives specifically within the Spruit. And we started the kind of design process by having on-site interviews with people that have actually used the Spruit and use it daily. And this is the interview we had with him. He's been living in the park since 1989, so over 30 years. And he does that to be able to support his family that live in an informal settlement in Kyalami. He's got 3 kids, and he's a waste recycler, which is very common within the South African condition, that waste recyclers, there's kind of a new economy of waste actually having a value to it. And so these guys will get up very early in the morning, sometimes 2-3 o'clock in the morning, to go and kind of search through these wealthier and middle-class suburbs through their rubbish and kind of separating them into different resources that they actually make their living from. And as you can see, there's kind of a whole microeconomy around different values to these resources. And I chatted to him a bit about how much he would like to earn, trying to kind of understand the microeconomy of that, what would help to kind of make his job easier, and what would be his kind of dream. And he's really become the hero for us in terms of this project. The last question you'll see, would you like to do another job? He said he would love to farm, which is quite an interesting one. And they actually started urban farming in the park 3 years ago, but some people stopped them. There's no kind of existing policy within city parks to encourage urban farming yet. And so we wanted this project to kind of become a precedent for that. Our first starting point in terms of looking at the project was what we termed ecological regeneration, which is choosing a reference habitat for the site that linked to its original condition kind of before the city came. And there's 3 kind of step process that we looked at that, kind of removing invasive species, like you'll see on the right, giant reed. Invasive species are species that come in and really completely disrupt an ecological system and really don't allow any other species to thrive. Secondly is to install litter traps, remove litter. And then the 4th one is starting to reintroduce endemic plant and fish species. So the streams of Johannesburg originally contained about 14 different fish species, and at the moment there is 0. So we're starting from that kind of point. So that was our first plan, to start to kind of reintroduce a functional ecological system. Secondly, flash floods are common in Johannesburg. That's typically because we've got a lot of hardscaping, and a lot of that stormwater is generated into our rivers that cause a lot of soil erosion and other things, and homeless sleep underneath this bridge that floods. So there have been a couple of people that have actually drowned underneath this exact bridge because of people sleeping there. So we, in terms of our approach to that, we've decided to encourage an art gallery that functions at nighttime, that is designed by the local art school to exhibit their works, their student work, to kind of discourage people from living underneath the bridge. So that's our second project in this project. And then the heart of the scheme is really this urban farming system that provides high quality, locally produced produce that can be used within the local restaurant market, which is kind of targeting the middle and higher class realm. And you do have, interestingly enough, the parking lot of the art school is not used during the weekend. So we suggested that be kind of a food produce market during the weekend when that parking lot is not used. The 4th project involves kind of trying to activate, this is where the name comes from, kind of Park of Light, trying to activate the park at night. Generally, South Africans in Johannesburg are quite scared to walk around at night or use public space at night because of the fear of crime. And we really felt to kind of activate the space at night would be something wonderful. And so we've designed a lighting system that changes color depending on surrounding air pollution, kind of with our sustainability background. Air pollution is something that we don't see, but is really important in terms of our city. And there's been a whole move from the World Green Building Council called a program called Plant a Sensor, which is a digital system that you can put an air pollution monitoring sensor within a specific space, and that digitally connects to the cloud and is monitoring the whole world cities from this one point of view. We found this was kind of a great resource that we could almost hand back to the city and say, let's run this out across city parks and see where are our most polluted spaces, and what can we do to kind of mitigate those. So on the one side, you've got kind of the lighting system that kind of sits within the existing pylon network. And then the other major problem with our spray systems in Johannesburg is a heavily polluted water system. So you've got high levels of potassium and other things that just really don't allow anything natural to grow. And so we've suggested a water purification system that consists of kind of a reverse osmosis and UV treatment system. And so you've got this combination of both water purification and air purification that links into this ecological regeneration plan. Our last and probably most controversial aspect of the project is to provide homeless areas for the homeless to sleep, that we've kind of termed sleeping pods. These are designed, these kind of have an aluminium frame with an EFTE plastic cladding, and are really just designed for the homeless to have a safe and warm and out of the rain space to sleep during the night. This is the most controversial, as I've mentioned, because obviously as soon as you have people sleeping in parks or living in parks, that starts to change the zoning of the space from a public space to a private space. We do believe in the African condition, our amount of unemployment, other things, even people like Alfred that have lived in the park for 30 years, that we're not going to be able to solve park dwelling or homelessness with your typical European approach of, let's provide them some low-cost housing. These people are in the park for a specific reason. It's close to the places in which they can make a living. And so we believe we should meet people in terms of where they're at, and to provide policy and precedent for these people in terms of the park. So the idea of these pods is that they're only used at night. A place, the park isn't used at night at all by people generally. And during the day, the homeless are then employed by the urban farming scheme, obviously with Alfred as part of that management committee. And this is just a render of what potentially this park could look like. These are our details if you want to get hold of me or want to ask further questions, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mark. I see some interesting comments on the side. I think we will reserve questions for later, but right now, Nikki, it's over to you.
Thank you, Prof. So today I'm sharing the story of Gilifilan Park or Jeppe Park. I think it's important to say that this is one story of the park. And I think that given where this park is located and the different users of this park, there are many stories and many voices that could share the development of this park in different ways. And then secondly, to say, as I will point out in the presentation, the development of the park really took place through many hands. And I think it was really the willingness of these many hands to hand over at different times, starting from the community members who used it, the park to go along this process to develop it into a developed park. So really the focus of this Jeppe's Town Park is, it really is a contested space. And I think its location in Johannesburg really speaks to that contestation. So here just gives an indication of Jeppe's Town. It is on the eastern side of the inner city of Johannesburg. And this project comes out of a broader initiative to look at a plan for this eastern section of the inner city, really focused on improving housing opportunities as well as public amenities. Jeppe's Town is most notoriously known for the Jeppe's Town Volhunter hostel. And at various times, it has been the murder capital of the country. Just to give a little bit of background in terms of hostels, hostels were developed as housing primarily for male laborers on the mines. And they continue to be really dehumanized spaces. Estimates around the Jeppe's Town hostel indicate that there's up to 3,000 unemployed men living up to 16 people in a room in terrible conditions. And as the Nduna of the hostel really says here, they have largely been a forgotten community. But Jeppe Park is located just 2 blocks from the hostel and historically has played an important role, in particular for the hostel dwellers, specifically around traditional Zulu dancing, Ngoma dancing. And this is a video, it's not great quality, of prior to when the park was developed, where you can see on Sunday the crowds that gathered to use the space for traditional dance. This project was developed largely in partnership with the Bayala Foundation. Bayala are an affordable housing developer who are located just across from the park, and they had been in Jeppe's Town for around a decade before we started this project. And they're very focused on not only providing housing solutions, but for example, education solutions. So they have a school, an ECD, and a tertiary education center on their ground floor. And we, as the JDA, together with City Parks and Zoo, partnered with them for the development of the park but specifically Bayala were commissioned to do an analysis as well as a community engagement process for Jeppe Park. So the work that I'll show for the following slides really come from the Bayala Foundation. And you can see here, this was the start of the partnership with City Parks and Zoo and Bayala. So the first part of the analysis was really understanding how did the park work in a very, very detailed way. So we're lucky enough to have one of the Bayala Foundation researchers live in the Bayala building and really analyze the weekly schedule of the park. So understand in a detailed way the different users, when they were using it, how they were using it, and very importantly, which particular spaces in the park they were using. And then in terms of the design process, they used 5 very, very simple tools, and they ran through these tools at some focus group sessions, like for example, with the school children in the streetlight school across from the park, with the people, primarily factory workers who play soccer during lunchtime every day at the park, a number of private developers, and most importantly, with community members, specifically through a park open day. And so the first one was really focused on what are the rules for the park. And that was really important in establishing what park users really wanted to see was allowed and not allowed in the park going forward. The second tool was what I like and what I don't like. Again, a very, very simple tool, but really provided some critical factors. So when there was first talk of developing the park, there was a lot of concern in the community about whether the park would remain free and an open public space for everybody to use. And you can see that the continuation of the Ngoma dancing was really, really important for the space. And then we looked at what is most important to me. And very interestingly, we see this in a number of public spaces in Johannesburg, was toilets or ablutions, which is something that our public spaces often lack, but is really, really integral to users utilizing them. And luckily enough, we were able to include pretty much everything on the what is most important list. And then users were asked to design the park, so provide their own pictures. And this was also a very, very useful exercise to understand exactly how people were imagining different activities could take place in the park. And I'll speak to the next slide, just focusing a little bit on this one. You can also see that the template provided to the users to draw in the park included the footpaths that had been made in the park historically for many years. And the final design, while not able to keep all of those footpaths, managed to keep the majority of them. So really focused on how people moved through the space historically. And that was really around where things should go. And this exercise, when the open day happened, didn't actually function that well. It was a very windy day and people were supposed to put exactly where they think different elements should go in the park. And a lot of them blew away. But I think the initial analysis and as well as the drawings really helped cement that. So this is the final park design that was developed and really tried to incorporate all these different elements that users asked for, as well as I indicated, really maintain these footpaths that were so integral to the park development. I think some contestations and negotiations. So after the Bayala Foundation had concluded their reports, there was a request that the JDA allocate budgets to upgrade the park. So it was really going from the hands of the community giving their ideas into Bayala's report, which was commissioned with City Parks and Zoo, to the hands of the JDA, which included a new team to work on the space. We were very lucky in that the team, and in particular the architects, KWP Creates, were very, very willing to listen and very, very willing to take the work in the analysis into development. It sounds like a simple thing, but it was really important for this park's development. And then we moved into the implementation, and even the implementation was a negotiated process. So in developing a park and getting everybody to an open day to give their ideas, it obviously didn't solve some of the larger issues in Jeppe's town. And so on the site itself, there was still the effects of the crime and violence of the broader neighborhood was felt, where 2 of the local community members who were commissioned to work on the park unfortunately were killed in developing the park. The information we received was not having to do with their involvement in the park itself, but rather broader issues in the neighborhood. But I think it's just important to illustrate that, that the public space was developed in a negotiated way, and that the issues in the broader neighborhood were not necessarily resolved in this public space and continue to be negotiated in its use. And then the ablution facility, unfortunately, due to planning, it couldn't be built at the same time as the park. So that was only recently completed. And again, it was a negotiation. So the original design, which you can see here, really looked at quite a permeable facility. And the idea was that with quite hard industrial fittings, it could be cleaned in a very simple way, hosed down essentially, and really be a very robust feature. However, when we went into implementation, this type of design did not speak enough to the local labor jobs that could be created in developing the ablution. So the facade had to be changed to brickwork, which would employ very many more people in the design of the park. So this is the park today. I'll show this video from Streetlight School. I think it's important to say that the park is not only used by Streetlights, but also by nationwide schools and by another 3 ECDs from the education sector. And let me show you.
I wish the world knew the fact that they are out there, there's lawyers out there, there's policemen out there, all these different careers that are out there. Starts here. Starts with us, teachers.
My dream for Streetlight is that we can lead the way in showing all the other schools in South Africa and the world how compassionate, inspiring, community-driven education can be done, and that that vision and that approach led by our teachers and our learners will come to dominate the way that we see teaching and learning being done in the world.
It's not only about me going to work, it's more than a job to me. It's about making a difference. It's about changing lives. It's about making the world a better place. I wish the world.
So we can see in that video that the space is really important for Streetlights in particular, but the broader schools, and especially I think as urban schools, which don't have the availability for a lot of public space. But it like I said earlier, it hasn't solved all the issues in Jeppe's town. And as much as the space is being utilized positively, this picture in particular shows a discussion where the Minister of Police spoke to Jeppe's town residents in 2019 around the xenophobic attacks. So yes, this is really a small story about the development of Jeppe Park. It's about negotiation. It's about trying to find ways to develop a space that all these different users can continue to use it. It's knowing that it's a space where its function is negotiated every day. And so this last slide just thanks some of our critical partners in developing this park. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicolette, for that. And thank you to our three presenters, Ayanda, Mark, and Nikki. Before I think we go into questions, I note the comments in the chat there. Yasmin, we are supposed to have that Menti question. You must guide me when we do that, when we ask participants. When is it going to come through? Before I open the floor for comments.
I think we can do it now, if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. On the side there will be a link. There's a question that we want to, or a poll that we want to conduct that speaks to the question of public space. There it is. And there's a code there. Yasmin, can you guide us how we do it?
Okay, if everybody can go to mentimeter.com either on your browser or on your mobile phone. And then from there, they will ask you to type in a code. I'll just type the code in the chat.
Presentation.
Sorry? Oh, it's in the chat. The code is in the chat, and then you will be prompted to answer this question. What kind of themes and tools are you interested in the Center of African Public Spaces developing and sharing?
Yasmin, can we hold on this Menti? I've been reminded. Ayanda needs to wrap up her presentation, so apologies to everyone. Ayanda, will you please go ahead?
Thank you so much. Well, I won't be long. I think we heard from Mark and Nikki. I think there are two exciting initiatives. Mark's initiative shows us how we can tackle the issues that we're grappling with in different cities, and how we can design public spaces differently or redesign, but also how we can look at our work differently. And Nikki's presentation showed us that, in fact, we can experiment as local government, and we can work with communities. And it showed the different uses that I was talking about, and different meanings of public space, and the need for city practitioners to be able to do these negotiations and facilitations. So I just want to present what are some of the things that are standing on the way. Like, you might be asking yourselves, okay, you experimented this in Jeppe's town. Why don't you do it all over the city or in other cities in Africa? So some of the practical issues are around the fact that when we talk about public spaces or green spaces in African cities, they are often viewed as an afterthought because of competing demands, such as housing, water, sanitation, and so forth. And also there's an issue of insufficient budget, meaning that even though, even where capital costs of investment in these spaces have been marshaled, the infrastructure is often in a state of disrepair because of limited funding associated with maintenance. And another issue is the fact that you cannot always assign a quantifiable economic value when you talk about, for instance, green spaces, because, I mean, they have an intrinsic value. Not that you can't assign this quantifiable value, but it's more complex, especially for cities, and that place that place them in a state of being vulnerable to urban pressures. I think another issue, the greater coordination and collaboration that is needed. I mean, listening to these two initiatives, it is difficult to achieve because of silo governance. So the need for integrated development thinking and alignment across silos becomes very important. I won't speak to everything. So what is the problem that the center is trying to address? I think when we started working in the inner city of Johannesburg, we wanted to find out what are other African cities doing around public spaces. Yes, we've got this issue around safety. So even if they tackle another issue around waste or homelessness, we saw that there's limited documentation about African public spaces. Yes, there are documentation, there's documentation about other cities in the global south, like you find Medellin and others. And it's not that there isn't much that is happening. There are people who are doing things or maybe turning dumping sites into public spaces that are workable, but they are not labeled as public space to start with. But also, we don't know because the information or the knowledge is siloed and disconnected. And working with universities and other cities, we saw that there's limited range of planning and design practices to sort of imagine the public spaces that could work and engage our urban problems and everything that we're grappling with. And when it comes to planning legislation in a number of African cities, we see that they date back to colonial times, and universities is the same thing. Curriculum is based on theories of the global north, which is so problematic. And again, because of the nature of our continent, is so vast and varied, and even if we go to international conferences, we can't find like case studies from other cities, particularly from countries like the Lusophone voice, countries that speak Portuguese and also French. There's some disconnect. And the other thing that I want to mention, I won't mention everything, is the fact that civil society organizations and other cities are worried about this loss of public space, mainly because of development funded projects in their countries, and others citing the fact that it's difficult to nudge Chinese funded projects in an environmentally friendly direction, which in itself is like calls for strong civil society organizations to advocate for public spaces. So just to reflect on some of the markers, I want to talk about the Inner City pilot project, because I already mentioned the work that we did in the inner city around creating safer spaces. But because we were supported by GIZ, but also by UN Habitat, we got to be exposed, or we got to attend a number of international platforms, which were so important for us, because this is where we could have conversations with other African cities. And what was important also in our work with universities is the fact that that work elevated the shortage of skills that are so crucial. I mean, Nicolette discussed about negotiating different interests and different uses of public space. So those skills are so important. Skills around convening multi-stakeholder processes and also inclusive conversations. So it's skills that are so limited at the local government level. And then another issue that is so important is, okay, we are doing all these pilots and we are undertaking these research studies with universities. Where does that information go, or where does that knowledge go? Do we inform policies? Do we inform strategies? So that's the gap we are sitting with at the moment. The lessons that we are learning, there's a disconnect between that and practice. So how can we embed everything that we are learning into routines and systems of government, but also society? So when we established this center, we were saying that we need a home. And we need a home, but also we need a community of African urban practitioners. People who are working around public space, but also who are passionate and want to. And also we need to engage scholars, so we need African universities so that we can generate new theories and knowledge. And also we need civil society organizations, people who are dedicated to connect, but also to advance knowledge and exchange homegrown solutions and share resources, grow expertise, and mobilize ourselves as Africans on a number of issues related to public space. So to avoid the center being or calling it an African center, but it's based in South Africa, we're envisaging having hubs across the continent that will be developed because we've got a network already to draw upon diverse strengths of different cities and countries. For instance, in East Africa, we've got Ethiopia that are sort of grappling with issues of greening. So that could be a theme. And our neighboring country, Mozambique, a theme could be around how public spaces are helping them in tackling disasters. And South Africa, it could be safety. So things like that, in order to understand the regional and local meanings, and also understanding that our contexts are different. So in terms of the work of the center, beside knowledge management, which is the core or who we are as the center, we are envisaging having these 3 work streams that we see as fundamental if you want to start turning a corner in terms of how public spaces are thought of, created, and functioning. So we have learned from our experiences working with universities and other stakeholders that we need a new cohort of city practitioners that understands the urban context and the need to decolonize, and also that recognizes the need for integrated development thinking on how we develop policy, how we implement our programs, and so forth and so on. Really the things that Marc and Nikki presented. So we need city practitioners that recognize and understand the root cause of these wicked issues that we're grappling with, and that they are complex and interdependent, but also they are systematic. So at the heart of that is the gap that we see is these skills for facilitation. So the first work stream is around public sector capacity strengthening, to strengthen city practitioners to do this kind of work. And the second one is around active citizenship. We have learned that one of the problems in terms of why we are not really creating the kind of cities that we want is that we like to work alone as city governments. And we realize that there's a need to empower communities to lead the process and take ownership of public spaces. And COVID has taught us this. And we saw how community structures plug the gaps in places where as government you couldn't. So this work stream is around knowing that there are many communities across the continent who are already doing work, wonderful work. So the stream is about how do we connect those successful community practices on public spaces across the continent. We know in Kenya there are examples where civil society organizations advocated and stopped government from building national roads in the middle of parks. So issues like that. So we need to learn from each other. We've also observed working with universities that we need a center that could be a platform to generate or to help them generate case studies so that what they teach at universities engages with urban problems and urban realities. So even though the work of the center through these 3 work streams, so the one around universities or engaging universities is around how do they teach, how do they undertake research in a manner that is cross-sectoral, but also in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary manner, using different styles and also teaching. So even though the work of the center through these 3 work streams will be Africa focused, but it will also be global South oriented through our strong partnership with international agencies like UN Habitat, GIZ, and Placemaking X. And that will offer us an opportunity for comparative learning in terms of other cities in the global South. Just to say several themes that are coming up, I won't mention all of them, is the fact that I think one of them that is so important to me is the one that's related to cities as spaces for opportunities for all. And it's important because we had a co-learning program with UCT, University of Cape Town, with UN Habitat and Hendrik Bol Foundation, where we collected stories from communities about how they're experiencing public spaces during COVID. So there's one story that was really painful to hear, is one of Mahosi Letimile, who is on a wheelchair. She says, every activity of my life is an act of protest because of the way she's navigating the city. So even though the pandemic has sort of shed light on an array of social inequalities, when it comes to disability, it has made an already invisible segment of population even more so. Other issues around land invasion or development, sometimes we've got polarized state responses when dealing with urban poor, or when we're dealing with how development is taking place by developers or by affluent communities. So a challenge for us, yes, we are trying to do things differently, but it's about how to embed and institutionalize these findings, these lessons from all these projects, and the disconnect that is there between universities, civil society organizations, and also government. So we hope by working together through the center, we can be able to start tackling those challenges. So how do you get involved in the center? So those are my details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayanda, for that very comprehensive wrapping up of the project. I'm aware of the time, but I'm also aware of the discussion that is brewing on the side. Will it be okay, Yasmin, if we skip your mentee response and then have a bit of discussion, then we can come back to the mentee collection of responses to your question.
Yes, it's okay.
Would it be, yeah?
Yes. You can go ahead.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I won't summarize the presentations because I think Ayanda has comprehensively done that, but I'm interested in participants, attendees, to really raise some points that with which we can work with. One, considering the idea of the center itself, and in general, I think what public space means and could be. So I'll invite some questions now. If possible, raise your hand so that I can see you by that button on the top. I think it's at the bottom that you can use to raise your hand. So any questions now to the our three presenters, or anyone indeed, or just general comments? No, but I can pick up perhaps from Teboho's comment to start to kick off. Ayanda, you did mention, you did refer to it, that in governance there is the idea of silo governance practice in perhaps local authorities and other agencies. But also, I think the idea of silo mentality extends to education, for instance. I mean, I'm a landscape architect by training. Marc is an architect by training. But hardly in our curriculum do we get to sit with urban designers and planners and indeed the community facilitators to really understand the complex process of delivering a project, a landscape project or an open space project to the people. So that is something that, as you rightly said, we should address. I was wondering then, are there any approaches you think that we could make as recommendations, both for the governance in councils or education? What's your views? Any one of you can go. Ayanda, Nikki, and Marc, you're not responding to me, to my question. Marc? Marc's hand is up.
I think from my point of view, the most important thing, what you mentioned, Fizzy, is the collaboration between disciplines. So the biggest difficulty we found on our project is there's existing policy around how parks are used, which some of it is quite old policy. And generally there's a direct fight between the environmental side and the social side. So I think what's nice about the projects presented today is you've tried to balance both. So for example, the Braamfontein Spruit, it's seen as an official wetland, and so you're limited to EIA regulations and other things like that. I'd love us to be able to develop projects that actually balance the two, the social and environmental side. And I think the difficulty with explaining that to city officials is there's a lack of precedent of actual projects, even globally. And until we actually have that, we need projects like what you've seen in Jeppe Park. You know, some of the problems that we're facing, you don't have in the rest of the world. And so there isn't precedence, and there won't be until we actually develop them. Yeah, so that would be my comment.
Thank you, Marc. That's a really great point from which to reflect. Tarek is asking. Tarek, do you want to ask your question? I think you can articulate it better. You've got a question for Nikki.
Thank you, Dr. Finzi. Yes, I typed the question. It's just a question for Nikki. How did the project come to deal with all those different community stakeholders? Is that was that in the original brief, or was that something that in the JDA or the city parks, there were people who were particularly interested in that and were pushing for that kind of an approach? Thanks.
Thanks, Tariq. I think that's an excellent question. So I think you're aware in South African policy, we should always engage stakeholders in this way. I was actually just thinking, I hope that in a few years' time, it'll be very pedestrian, very normal, very usual process to develop public spaces in this way. But in this particular instance, I think really championed by City Parks and Zoo and the project that they had led at N Street North, which really involved engaging with stakeholders in a very comprehensive way, coupled with a real commitment from the JDA internally to improve our public participation. And then with having champions within Bayala in particular, in Jeppe's town, who had been there over a decade and had really come to the realization, I think, in some very difficult ways, that many things in Jeppe's Town in particular, you must develop together with people. Otherwise, they will not stand for the elements to remain in space. So I think those different actors and champions of that particular time came together in a very beneficial way, I would say, to approach the engagement specifically. But I think also the Jeppe's Town community more broadly had been neglected for so long, and really were wanting to engage with the state in particular to bring something to their neighborhood. So I'm sorry I'm not responding directly. I think it's really a multiplicity of different factors and different champions at a particular time that even now, a few years later, I'm not sure would come together in the exact same way.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikki, for that. Just to distribute the questions to Ayanda, Kevin asks, Kevin, do you want to actually ask the question rather than me reading it out?
Sure, I can go. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was very insightful. I think my question to Ayanda is, are there proactive policy changes in local government that adapt to our urban realities? So for example, when it comes to developing projects in the inner cities and in informal settlements, how's local government adapting to changing policies?
Thank you so much, Kevin. I think slowly, by engaging with universities and also with civil society organizations, local government is beginning to listen in terms of this need for looking at our work in an integrated fashion. So I'll take an example of a policy that is being revised now. It's not about informal settlements, but it's around homelessness, which was so difficult to sort of change. So I think the strategy that we had before, it was just evicting people, and we saw that is not working. But by working with Wits University and by listening to other cities like Tshwane municipality and eThekwini, and also by listening to to City Parks and JDA in terms of the pilot from the inner city around creating safer public spaces and seeing how homeless people ended up helping the city in terms of cleaning the park and things like that. So the city is beginning to listen in terms of what are the issues and how do you tackle the issue of homelessness in an integrated and humane way. So slowly there are changes, and the city is listening. I think listening, I keep on saying that we see that it's important, that you must really listen to the people, and they know exactly what they want. I think coming from an NGO sector before joining local government, we need a space to reflect. We need a space, like in all sectors, to ask ourselves, yes, we are doing wonderful work. We have this number of projects or initiatives, but are they really making an impact? And in order to answer that question, we need the actual people to be there, at the table, and we need to co-create with them. So with these pilots, Nicolette and I and others, there are other champions in other departments, we are trying to push that. And there was a question earlier on around how do we begin to do this integration and break these silos. And I think for me, the way we are starting to do it, yes, it's difficult in terms of red tape, in terms of systems and so forth, but there are people we must just identify, like a Nicolette in another department, people that you can work with and try and experiment and ask ourselves, can we do this differently? Who else is involved? Thank you.
Thanks, Ayanda. Sandra, you have a question for Marc. Maybe you can just say it out yourself. I know it's written there. Sandra? Maybe Sandra has problems with the mic. But Marc.
Hi, Dr. Finzi, sorry.
Yes. Okay, all right,
I
there you are.
couldn't speak at the moment. Yes, I just wanted to say I really like the project that Marc presented right now in terms of like from a socio-environmental perspective. I think that we need more pilots from that angle as well. But I just had like a quick question about what was the name of the pollution device or the online pollution platform. I'm not sure if I got it right that he mentioned, because I think this can also be used as a tool for like some of the communities affected by mine dumps in Johannesburg.
Hi, Sandra. Yes, so the device we designed ourselves, but the organization is called Plant a Sensor by the World Green Building Association. So I think if you just Google Plant a Sensor, that should come up. So that's that global network that I spoke about, where you can literally put up your data and it starts to read from a global point of view air pollution. So hopefully that helps you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra and Marc. There's a question, another question again from Kevin. Question to Marc again was the different stakeholders that were involved in the development of the sleeper pod. If you can speak to that.
Sure. The sleeper pod has been actually a couple of years in the making. We've been working with park dwellers or homeless for a while, and it really has come out of kind of an interview process, but the approach has really been more on the high-tech side. So there's been obviously a lot of work done with homeless in terms of kind of trying to move them into existing social housing or others, and we've just felt there's very little options when it comes to on-site facility, and that's generally because, like I mentioned before, that city policy doesn't support living in parks, even though it's a 30-year problem. So just a little bit about the pod itself. Like I mentioned, it's aluminium framed, so it's very lightweight, it's very easy to move, and then the cladding is ETFE, which is a high performance type of plastic. It's very, very, very light, about a couple 100 times stronger than glass. And it's like what you call a plastic pocket. It's 2 layers of plastic that are filled with air, so very, very good thermal performance. So again, we're trying to move away from housing for our most vulnerable people having to be the cheapest thing that breaks in the first couple of years. Why can't it be something beautiful that can actually enrich our parks? That was really the premise behind the project.
Thank you, Marc. Any other question, people, colleagues?
Temba's hand is up. And
Sarah's. Okay, maybe first let's go to Sarah. Sarah, you can, Sarah Jane, you can ask your question. I know you've typed it there, but rather ask it if you can. If not, then I'll read it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was just responding to what Marc was chatting about, and was wondering whether the sleeper pods have been used successfully anywhere else in Johannesburg. And then I suppose the second question is open to any one of the speakers. Just interested to know whether there are any other projects that have successfully used public spaces to accommodate homeless people, specifically in Johannesburg. I'm interested in hearing but anywhere else in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That's a great question. No, they haven't in terms of the sleeper pods. The best work that I've seen in terms of homeless interacting with public spaces has been in kind of the global third world. So, India, South America, where you actually have even things like bus shelters and others being used at night when they are not used during the public for sleeping spaces. Unfortunately, like I said, city policy, and you can even, when you go to the car train, those benches are designed at that specific gradient so that you can't sleep on them. There's generally quite a militant approach from a policy point of view to keep homeless people out of public space. So I do think until that kind of philosophy changes, there won't be any kind of wide precedent. So that would be just my comment on that. But thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Temba, your hand has been up for a while. Sorry, but you can go ahead, and I've seen the question. Just ask your question. Temba.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute. Thanks, Finzi, and thanks everyone for the great presentations and fascinating projects. I guess my question is a bit similar to the one Tariq asked of Nikki. And I think Nikki and Ayanda kind of answered parts of it. But it's just a bit more of a question about how do these kinds of projects get going? You've spoken a bit about the kind of champion side of it, but I'm just wondering if you can say anything more about how does one get a pilot project off the ground and get some sort of approval from relevant authorities, so to say, and how does a pilot then kind of translate into mainstream policy or practice? So like Mark mentioned, the potential for social and ecological crossover at the Braamfontein Spruit, and I'm researching Urban Park, where the Spruit, actually near where the Spruit originates. And I think there's also some scope there for projects that could combine that. But I'm just wondering, how does one get a pilot project going? And if there's such a thing, how do we kind of draw on that to legitimize further projects? Thank you.
Should I begin and then maybe?
Nicolette, yeah, go.
Great, Ayanda can speak more to the mainstreaming component. So I think that's an excellent question. And I wish I had a better answer, Temba. But essentially, in particular in the case of Jeppe Park, and having worked at the city for a while now, it's often almost the stars need to align, which is the worst answer a person could possibly give you. But in the case of Jeppe Park, the city had recently completed an urban development framework for that area. So it had already analyzed that there were required upgrades to public spaces as well as public amenities. So we're now in the process of developing a library there, which is even more exciting, I think, than the park. And so there had been budget allocated to that area. And so that really helped ensure that the pilot project could get off the ground, but it also wasn't without issues. So the public engagement process that I presented, largely led by Bayala with the analysis, took place, and then there was a year delay in getting the budget in order to start the implementation because there was an overall budget cut by the city of Johannesburg. So I'm giving you a very long answer, but I think utilizing all of the mechanisms available, whether it be understanding the city planning processes, utilizing the IDP sessions to get projects on priority lists, lobbying directly with particular city departments and understanding their planning and project pipeline over the next couple of years, as well as city priority areas. So it's a lot of different things that really make it so that projects can take place and these pilots can happen. And then when I think it comes to mainstreaming, I think Ayanda will be better to answer that question. But I think things like the center are so important because even me presenting today, there can be colleagues within my own organization who haven't really had the opportunity to reflect on this particular case study. And so it's really about finding opportunities to share information, to share lessons learned from different approaches in order to mainstream them into city processes.
Thanks, Nikki. Ayanda, do you want to comment, to add on that comment, on that question?
I think Nicolette covered everything. I'll just add the issue of openness, and also to and compassion. They're very important, and also to be modest in terms of what is it that you want to achieve. So if you have a project or you have a research strategy, and if you can't find ways of implementing the research strategy, but find some principles that you can get from that strategy or from that project and see how you can sort of integrate in various routines or systems of local government. I'll make an example. So in the inner city, we ended up using the lessons that we learned and developed a strategy on how to deal with safety in community parks. And we couldn't implement that strategy for a number of reasons. But we are implementing the principles of that strategy in a number of ways. And again, you can see pilots like this being implemented elsewhere. And you see our colleagues partnering with communities as a result of the work that we did in the inner city. So I think sometimes it's important to know, okay, it's not working out like on the whole, but where are some and identify some ways where you can implement some things. For instance, we are implementing safety audits that we started in the inner city, and we are translating that into standard operating procedures for park development and so forth and so on. So things like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayanda. Sandra, you had another question, but it's on the sleeper pod. I just wanted to shift the discussion a bit, I think, because I note, especially on the Jeppe project and even on the Braamfontein Spruit project, that there was very little mention in terms of one very critical stakeholder in the name of political groupings. And I think these are some of the groupings that, especially we as the academics, sometimes we ignore and many times we don't understand, but they do carry weight if you see the color of their attire, red, blue, green and black, yellow, and all of that. I wanted to know from Ayanda and Nikki, how much in terms of agency or maybe are they actively involved in delivering this innovative pilot projects? Anyone? Nikki or Ayanda?
Sure, I thought maybe Ayanda would like to start. You really know how to ask the difficult questions. So, I mean, from the system which we have, sorry about the noise, the political parties play a critical role in approving our budgets as the city, and so therefore do influence which public spaces are developed. But I found, and maybe this is just my own personal experience, and Ayanda can speak to more positive experiences, I found that when it comes to the actual design and in terms of programming of the space, that the political representatives, in particular the ward councillors and the ward committees, are not very vocal. The concern often, which makes a lot of sense in our context in South Africa and Johannesburg in particular, is the number of jobs and the local labor which will come out of those projects once they're implemented. So we have found that generally there might be a few inputs into the design process, but where the crux of the matter lies is how many people can be employed for the implementation of the project.
Thank you. Thank you. Quickly, Ayanda, before we go to Tariq, his hand is up.
Nicolette has covered everything.
Okay, that's good. Tariq, your hand is up. You can go.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just a question directed to Marc Sherratt. It's nice to see him doing some great work. First to him, but then to the other presenters as well. I mean, the project he speaks about is it's a really innovative project, almost too innovative, because it's really weaving, addressing the lowest, most vulnerable sectors of our society, and providing income for them, then also providing shelter, then also a really underpinned in an ecological and environmental prerogatives. So many different things are coming together. That's why I say it's almost too innovative. And he said that he approached the city. I just want to know how, without going into excruciating detail, who he approached and which city department and what was the kind of response to that. And then I'd also like to just open it up to the other presenters. The same theme which they can answer in whichever way they like. I mean, Ayanda's presentation was really really unpacking what a public space could be. Is it a social space, an economic space, a spiritual space? And in a way, Marc's proposal touches on several of those themes. How public space is not one thing, but depending on where you sit in your society, it serves many different functions. And obviously, our existing policies cannot deal yet with that kind of complexity. So yeah, it's just a question for Marc. Firstly, what was your experience? In other words, how did that pan out for you? That approach and the responses you got, and who you approached, and then for in the city, Nikki and Ayanda, what has been your experience in terms of understanding what a public space could be, and how you pursue that in terms of creating a more sort of integrated social reality, given how segmented and diverse our society is. How do you create public spaces to serve that? How do you create a new kind of public space? And then, the second part of the question is to get local governments, departments to start speaking to one another to produce, to make that possibility a reality. So those are sort of two parts to the question. The first is, we're describing public spaces in these very complex ways. And then the second part, I suppose, is a little bit more practical in the sense of how you actually go about putting a space like that together, bringing it into being, into reality. So that's for Marc, but then opened up to the other presenters as well.
Thanks, Tariq. It's a great question. So yeah, maybe a bit of background. When we've got a pro bono division in our firm that kind of takes 10% of our profits and invests them into kind of social upliftment projects. And this was one of the projects that we approached city parks with, just saying we want to give professional resources to where we see the need. And Ayanda was part of that initial conversation, and the department was city parks. And the conversation basically ended with, homelessness or park dweller, whatever term you want to use, is a difficult thing. And then the finances around maintenance of the park. So those were our first initial kind of brief targets. And I, the complexity of what you've spoken about, I feel like from a personal point of view, unless we're dealing with the complexity holistically, it's almost impossible to solve the problems. But then if you do deal with the complexity holistically, you find that the solutions are extremely powerful. So developing the urban farming scheme, which is basically a microeconomic system that is self-maintaining. So the restaurants, in terms of them wanting this kind of produce, and we've got an urban farming expert as part of the project, and he's given us all the kind of the calculations around the economics around this, can actually employ the amount of homelessness that live in this area. So even though the homelessness was a starting point, when you wrap the economic, environmental, and social in one project, you do find the solution. So that's the positive side. The negative side is the clash of existing policy. So when we've presented this to city parks, like I've mentioned, their position is generally on an environmental side. They see the Spruit as an ecological system that shouldn't be touched with human invasion almost. And they've got other problems. They've got other problems of people, building housing within city parks that they can't control. So there's a fear on that side, based with social development that says, we actually do need to protect our most vulnerable people, and they are fully for the project. So you've got kind of a clashing between existing policy and existing departments. But I think the key in the solution of it is finding these people within departments, because even within departments, this debate is happening. And probably my last comment in terms of making a reality is probably the only way to really convince certain people is to show a pilot project. I don't think we can do all the design and all the research, because there's people on this call like Sarah Charlton from WITS that has done amazing research on park dwellers in this specific part of the Spruit, but still there's no movement. So it's not even the research component that's missing. It's the physical project that's missing that says, let's test it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least we've got a testing platform, which, I hope the center that, is also excited about that aspect in terms of implementation. So my argument or my position is that it requires a precedent project that's involved with the complexity of something like this. But then you need professionals involved. And that's why we've set up our pro bono division. So at least, the professional side is covered. So I hope that starts to answer your quite difficult question, Tariq.
Thank you. Nikki, you want to add to that?
Sure. I think Marc has really encapsulated some of the real difficulty in trying to get some of these projects off the ground, and he's highlighted the practical elements behind that. And I think right at the end, his critical point about testing, and I think unfortunately, especially the city of Johannesburg, we're not really geared in a way that we can easily test and try and innovate with spending little resources and seeing what happens, and then building in the mechanisms to evaluate that test and indicate what it should guide us going forward. So it's not really responding to Tariq's question, but it's largely agreeing with Marc, and it's saying that I think the tactical urbanism approaches, which in many cities I think have largely been seen as very kind of place-making, pretty-making initiatives, but at the heart of tactical urbanism should be around the ability to utilize these minimal resources to test, to research, to evaluate, and then to go forward. So I think it's just largely agreeing with Marc and his statements. I don't know if Ayanda wants to add anything.
Thank you so much. Just to say that I agree, but also to say one of the real difficulties of city parks is the fact that I think before 2013, it used to report to the environmental cluster, because city parks is an implementation agency of the environment department, meaning we implement their policies. But at the same time, we report to community development, So meaning that if you look at it using that lens of community development, these are the kind of initiatives that Mark was presented that we're supposed to do. So I think there's a clash in terms of mandates, you can say, but also if you look at who is in city parks, there are not many people who have like geared towards community development. You find more environmentalists or ecologists and stuff like that. So even with the people as well. So there's like a clash of goals around social environment and stuff like that, meaning really this new cohort of city practitioners is needed that are seeing things like in terms of like in an integrated manner. Yeah. So just to answer Tariq, I think is through experimenting. That's what we're trying to do by doing these projects in N Street, Jeppe Park, and others, and also through establishing the center that we want to also address the question of timber about mainstreaming public space. Yeah.
Thank you, Ayanda, Nikki, and Mark. Mark, I was going to ask you that part of your answer to Tariq should have been to tell him where you actually studied and where you did your master's and who was your supervisor, but we'll leave that for another day. But I want to continue. Tumeleng, I really apologize for your question. We might skip it for now, but I really want us to get back to the Menti. Yasmin, do you have responses to us? We have some 12 minutes or so to consider. Yes.
I think what you're sharing
Yes,
is
you can go ahead. Yes. All right. Do you want to speak to it? I would like it if you speak to it. Okay, Yasmin, do you want me to? Yes,
no,
go ahead. Go ahead. Yes.
What I'm seeing is a lot of responses calling for toolkits, something that can be a guide for practitioners to work in, who are working in public space, and also a lot of collaboration and knowledge sharing. I think that speaks to what we were talking about, some of the challenges about people working in silos. So the importance of sharing knowledge and sharing projects with each other.
Okay.
Collaborative design, more education in terms of developing integrated knowledge on public spaces, and then how to enhance social connection and social cohesion with, in various projects. Also, what came up for me, and it's coming up here also, is the power of co-producing public spaces together with communities. I think that's a big, I think that's an important feature of creating productive and vibrant public spaces for people who use them.
Okay. Thank you. I think that co-production was really evident in those two, the Jeppe project and the Braamfontein Spruit, as a process through which we can create innovative projects. So that's really interesting that it comes up again. I do think we've got roughly about 10 minutes. Any final questions, maybe questions about the mentees before I just give ask 1 minute summary by Ayanda, Nikki, and Mark, and then I summarize and close. Any pressing questions? Anyone? Anyone? Great question. Okay. If not, then Ayanda, your last comments? Or maybe should I start? Let me start with Mark first. Mark?
Yeah, I think I just encourage everyone that firstly, our problems are extremely difficult. Like, let's not underestimate how difficult they are. They're not going to be solved with one project, but that there are so many people working in cities across the continent, you know, for free or with NGOs or with the city doing amazing things. So don't get discouraged about how difficult the problems are. And then also just, you know, support your local community forum when it comes to your if it's your ward councillor or your local political representative, because these conversations of having quality public space won't become, you know, headline items unless we do that as citizens. So just to encourage people to be talking about these things. You know, I know in my suburbs it's just, you know, no one cares about the public space, so no one talks about it. I think COVID's helped us change that attitude. Because, you know, we've actually needed our public spaces because we can't really go anywhere else. So yeah, that would be my last thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Nikki?
Thank you. I think it's been a really great session, and I think the critical questions about how public spaces are prioritized, how they're budgeted, how they are looked at by different city governance departments around particular silos have all been incredibly important questions, and really, for me, move towards thinking about more transparency in the way in which we function as cities. And I think critically, Ayanda will speak to this, initiatives like the Center on Public Space in Africa are so important for that transparency, for allowing citizen actors, for allowing researchers, for allowing different city departments to understand those processes and to work together through them. So I think the questions and the discussion has been really, really important and interesting. So really just a thank you from my side.
Thank you, Nikki. Ayanda?
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. I think for me, what is coming up very clearly from hearing people's comments, but also the presentations, how important co-creation is. And I think my message for today is that you have power wherever you are, especially if you are an ordinary citizen sitting at home. You have power to organize, like Mark was saying, to be part of something so that you can be heard. Sometimes as city governments, we don't hear views of people because they are like individuals. But if you are a group, where there is a park structure that you can form, or part of residents association, things like that, we can hear you. Because there's a danger of not engaging the city, because yes, we fight internally, we try to like effect change through these pilots, through thinking through with other people, like how do we sort of tackle different problems differently. But if there isn't anyone like from the outside who's trying to like hold us accountable, then we'll rehash the same kind of plans that we've been implementing in 1900. So we need like civil society organizations to push us towards the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayanda. Nikki and Mark. I think from my side, I've always been the teacher, and I've always been one who shakes up the education system, making other academics uncomfortable, but at the same time offering an alternative and arguing for an alternative way of teaching. And I think that those of you who have followed the questions of decolonizing knowledge, that's exactly, I think, what the idea of the Center for African Public Spaces will be doing, putting it into action, hence my interest. And so the experimentation that we are seeing through these innovative projects is really an attempt to redefine what we teach our future architects, our future planners, our future urban designers. It is what it means to decolonize the practice, the design practice in the environmental realm. So I'm very, very rejuvenated by all this debate, and to see at the center of it many of my former students really pushing this agenda. But also, I think for me, what is important, what no one else here maybe might not be seeing, that the two critical leaders at the center of this push are women. And so I really thank Ayanda for driving it from her city of Johannesburg and her driving this agenda of co-production of knowledge, whether it's in governance, whether it's in design. I think that is really at the center. With Nikki also at the JDA driving the agenda, it is for me what I would call a win-win situation. The idea, as some of the takeaways that I'm going to go away with here, of establishing these hubs, public space hubs within the African continent, also speaks to co-production, also speaks to giving agency to the local population. I think that is something that we must really push so that the center achieves this, because only then will we be able to present an alternative to design approaches. The Western approach is always to come with the architect and the designer who knows it all. But these two projects and these processes that we've discussed here has really begun to address an alternative which we can call, I think we'll be able to call as an African approach. Whether it starts from a South African approach, it doesn't matter, but it will be an African approach which is a viable alternative. And the idea of experimenting at all levels, and having that confidence and having that backing from the city of Johannesburg for JDA, I think is really what is going to ensure that we do change or do make meaningful change. So with that, colleagues, I'm very excited to be part of this discussion. I must thank you for making time to join us here, the organizers, technical side, Yasmin there, the presenters, Marc, Ayanda, and Nikki there. Really great, thank you. I think the dialogue is not going to die. We are going to continue with this dialogue. And please, I urge you to keep in touch and raise those very hard, difficult questions that we must grapple with in order to achieve our goal of a collaborated co-production of public space that is meaningful in our African cities. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you.